6 years running my blueberry farm alone. Then the HOA president started sending strangers into my rows. Free pickers. No payment. Neighbors gasped when I finally said no. I just smiled and kept my camera rolling. Something in her eyes changed that morning. She didn't know what I'd been counting. By harvest season, one of us wouldn't be picking anymore. My name is Danny Reyes, 38, and I run Hollow Creek Blueberry Farm on 3 acres my grandfather planted in 1974. After my divorce, this farm became more than land. It became the only steady thing keeping my 2 kids, Mia and Theo, fed, housed, and proud of their mother instead of pitying her. Maple Hollow Estates grew up around my property over the years, ranch houses replacing old orchards, until my farm sat like a green island inside a subdivision. I paid HOA dues like everyone else, kept my fences painted, my hedges trimmed. I never asked for trouble. Trouble, turned out, had already elected herself president. Karen Whitfield became HOA president 3 years ago, running unopposed after the last president moved away. She had a talent for sounding helpful while making every decision about herself, and a habit of showing up wherever she wasn't invited, clipboard in hand, smile stretched a little too wide for comfort. Her reign started small. Mailbox colors, lawn heights, holiday lights left up 2 days too long. Homeowners grumbled but complied, because arguing with Karen cost more energy than repainting a mailbox. She wasn't cruel outright. She was thorough, relentless, and always framed her demands as being for the good of everyone. My farm predated the entire subdivision, grandfathered into every zoning map long before Karen's cul-de-sac existed. Still, she treated Hollow Creek like an inconvenient leftover, something quaint that hadn't gotten the memo to modernize. She'd mention, almost fondly, how charming it would be if the farm felt more like a shared amenity. The spring newsletter that year included a section titled, "Beautifying Our Shared Spaces," with a photo of my blueberry rows captioned as if they already belonged to the community. I read it twice, unsettled by how casually my grandfather's land had been folded into someone else's vision for Maple Hollow Estates. Every summer, the HOA hosted socials in the common green just past my fence line. Potlucks, movie nights, a 4th of July barbecue that drew half the neighborhood. I never minded the noise or the extra foot traffic near my property. Good fences, I figured, made good neighbors, and mine were sturdy. One afternoon Karen wandered over during a picnic setup, gesturing toward my rows like she was already picturing families wandering through them. "Wouldn't it be wonderful," she said, "if guests could just walk through and experience a real working farm?" I laughed politely, assuming she was simply daydreaming out loud. When she asked outright a week later, I declined as kindly as I could. I explained insurance requirements, the cost of maintaining rows for paying customers, the simple fact that this was my livelihood, not a neighborhood attraction. She nodded slowly, said she understood completely, and I believed her. Within days, comments started surfacing on the neighborhood app. Nothing direct, just vague remarks about certain residents who didn't want to share the community spirit. I recognized Karen's fingerprints on the phrasing immediately, even though her name never appeared beneath a single post. My neighbor Mr., a retired man who'd lived in Maple Hollow since before it had a name, stopped by one evening with a plate of tamales and a warning. "She did this to the Petersons' bakery stand years back," he said quietly. Be careful how much rope you give her. I hadn't heard that story before. Apparently, a small home bakery once operated 2 streets over, until Karen decided it violated residential character, pushed a bylaw change through, and the family closed within a year. Nobody on the current board even remembered it, but Mr. Alvarez remembered everything. Board members, I noticed, rarely disagreed with Karen in meetings. They'd exchange glances, shift in their seats, then vote whichever way she nodded. It wasn't fear exactly, more exhaustion, the kind that comes from years of picking battles and always losing to the loudest person in the room. My U-Pick season opened in late May like it always did. $5 entry, buckets provided, cash box on the honor table by the gate. Regulars came back year after year. Kids growing taller in the same photos I kept taped above my register. A small quiet joy each season brought. Karen showed up that first weekend, walking the rows with her arms crossed, inspecting rather than picking. She commented on a sagging trellis wire, suggested I really ought to modernize the entrance, and left without buying a single berry. I chalked it up to her being Karen. Nothing more. A few days later, she floated an idea to the board. Designate my farm an official community experience partner, giving HOA event guests complimentary access during socials. She presented it as generosity on my part, a gift to the neighborhood, conveniently skipping the part where nobody had asked me. I stood up at that meeting and explained, calmly, why that wouldn't work. Insurance covered paying, registered visitors, not unscreened crowds wandering unsupervised through working rows. Liability alone could bankrupt me if someone tripped on an irrigation line. This wasn't stinginess, it was survival. Plain and simple. Karen smiled through the whole explanation, said, of course, and moved the meeting along. But something in the set of her jaw told me the idea hadn't died. It had simply gone somewhere I couldn't see it, waiting for a moment when I wasn't in the room to object. I'd always kept careful records, out of habit more than suspicion, every basket weighed, every entry logged, every dollar tracked for tax season. My grandfather taught me that a farm without books was a farm waiting to fail. I never imagined that habit would one day become my sharpest weapon. Karen's husband stayed mostly invisible around the neighborhood, but her son Braden I knew a little. A polite young man who'd recently taken a job with the county code enforcement office. I remembered congratulating his mother on it at a mailbox one morning, never guessing the name would matter later. The neighborhood app buzzed constantly that summer. Karen's posts always polished, always framed as looking out for everyone's best interest. Disagreements there rarely stayed civil for long, and I learned quickly to say less online and document more in private, where words couldn't be twisted by morning. Then, out of nowhere, a code violation notice appeared in my mailbox citing my farm stand sign as non-conforming. My sign hadn't changed in 4 years, hadn't caused a single complaint before. The timing, arriving 3 days after that shot-down board proposal, felt far too convenient to be coincidence. I paid the small fine, corrected nothing because nothing needed correcting, and filed the notice away in a folder I hadn't realized I'd started keeping. Some quiet part of me sensed this wasn't finished. I just didn't yet know how far Karen was willing to go to win. The HOA's summer kickoff picnic arrived in June. Tables and canopies filling the common green right beside my fence line. I worked my own farm stand that morning, expecting nothing unusual, until I noticed a hand-lettered sign near the picnic pointing guests toward The community blueberry experience. My rose. By noon, dozens of picnic guests had wandered straight through my open gate, buckets from the party in hand, picking freely with no cash box, no entry fee, no one checking in. Children ran between the trellises while parents chatted, all of them clearly under the impression this had been arranged. I found broken canes along the third row, entire branches stripped bare. A section that normally yielded steady income for weeks reduced to nothing in a single afternoon. My stomach dropped as I did quick math on the loss. Watching strangers laugh and fill buckets meant to be sold, not gifted. I found Karen near the dessert table and asked, as evenly as I could manage, who had authorized guests into my rows. She blinked at me with practiced innocence. Everyone just loves a farm experience, she said. I assumed it was fine after our conversation. We had never agreed to any such thing. It turned out Karen had printed flyers days earlier announcing a special partnership with Hollow Creek Farm for picnic guests, distributing them without ever telling me a single word. Several confused visitors showed me the flyer directly, apologizing once they realized the partnership existed only in Karen's imagination. I walked the rows that evening with a notepad, counting broken stems, missing baskets worth of fruit, damaged irrigation line where someone had stepped through wet mulch chasing a dropped bucket. The loss came to nearly $300 in a single unplanned afternoon. Money I genuinely couldn't spare. I asked Karen, politely but firmly, for some acknowledgement of the damage, even just an apology to soften the blow. Instead, she suggested I should have posted clearer signage if I truly didn't want visitors, as though the burden belonged entirely to me instead of the woman who'd printed false flyers. I bought rope and metal stakes that weekend, marking a clear boundary along the picnic-facing side of my property, with small hand-painted signs reading Private Farm, Paid Entry Only. It felt absurd to need signs for land my family had worked since before Maple Hollow existed at all. Less than 2 weeks later, during a smaller HOA movie night social, it happened again. This time guests slipped past my rope boundary entirely, several claiming Karen herself had waved them through, gesturing toward the rows like a tour guide welcoming visitors into an attraction she personally curated for the evening. I walked outside mid-movie to find Karen actually inside my third row, leading 4 families between the bushes, narrating like she'd planted every bush herself. My rope lay trampled flat in the grass behind her, clearly stepped over rather than accidentally crossed by anyone paying the slightest attention. I asked everyone, as gently as the situation allowed, to step back onto community land. The families looked embarrassed, clearly unaware they'd done anything wrong, and left quickly. Karen stayed exactly where she stood, arms crossed, watching me handle her mess with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You made a scene in front of children," Karen said loudly enough for nearby residents to hear. "Over some berries." A few neighbors nodded along without knowing the full story, and I felt the familiar sting of being cast as the difficult one for simply protecting what was mine to protect. That night I sat at my kitchen table and started something new. A spreadsheet, dated entries, unauthorized visit counts, estimated basket losses down to the dollar. Not for anyone else yet, just for myself. A way to hold on to facts when everyone around me seemed intent on rewriting them. The following week I ordered 4 discrete trail cameras, the kind meant for tracking deer, and mounted them at each row entrance and the main gate. My ex-husband used to tease me for over-planning everything. This time, Overplanning felt less like a habit and more like a quiet act of self-defense. Installing them took an entire Sunday afternoon, angling each lens carefully to catch faces without catching my own paying customers unnecessarily. I told myself it was simple security, nothing more. The same reasoning any small business owner might use after two costly, unauthorized incidents in a single month. The first useful footage came faster than expected. Grainy but clear enough. It showed Karen at dusk 3 days later, personally unlatching my main gate for a small group of guests, checking over her shoulder before waving them through with the easy confidence of someone who'd done this many times. What stopped me cold wasn't just seeing her open the gate. It was how easily the latch gave way. That gate had a keypad lock installed 2 years ago, a code I'd only ever shared with my kids and a former contractor. Karen shouldn't have known those numbers at all. I remembered, slowly, that the contractor who'd installed the keypad had also done small landscaping work for several HOA board members that same season. It wasn't hard to imagine a shared code slipping loose in casual conversation. One small careless moment years ago quietly handing Karen a key she was never meant to have. I changed the gate code that same night. Told no one, not even Mr. Alvarez yet. I wanted to understand its full shape before I said a single word aloud. Silence, I decided, would tell me more right now than confrontation ever could. The next HOA newsletter arrived days later, glossy and cheerful, praising Karen Whitfield's tireless leadership in expanding community farm experiences this summer. My own name appeared nowhere in the piece. My rose reduced to unnamed scenery in someone else's story about generosity that was never actually hers to give. Reading that newsletter, something in me hardened. This had stopped being an accident, a misunderstanding, or even simple entitlement. Karen was building a reputation on the back of my family's land. One stolen basket and one borrowed gate code at a time, and I intended to understand exactly how far it went. I drafted a formal letter to the HOA board that week, laying out dates, damage estimates, and a clear request for a written agreement preventing any future unauthorized access to my property during community events. I kept my language calm and professional, determined not to hand Karen an easy excuse to dismiss me. The board scheduled a meeting to discuss it 2 weeks out, longer than I liked, but I used the time to organize my photographs, my spreadsheet, and printed stills from the camera footage into a single folder. Mr. Sit beside me that night, and I gladly accepted the company. The clubhouse felt fuller than usual when I arrived. Folder tucked under my arm. Stomach tight with nerves I hadn't expected after years of running my own business without flinching. Karen sat at the head table already, composed, notes arranged neatly, looking every bit like a woman certain of her footing. Before I could even present my case, Karen opened the meeting with her own remarks, thanking residents for their enthusiasm about the farm experience and framing the entire summer as a heartwarming community success story, one she'd apparently spearheaded entirely out of neighborly generosity toward all of Maple Hollow. I watched several board members nod along, the same tired nods I'd seen for years, agreement offered simply to avoid friction. Struck me, not for the first time, how much authority Karen held not because anyone truly trusted her, but because nobody wanted the exhausting job of standing against her. When my turn finally came, I laid out the dates, the damage totals, the flyers guests had shown me themselves. A few murmurs rippled through the room, sympathetic enough that I felt a flicker of hope the evidence might actually land the way facts were supposed to land. Karen responded smoothly, calling my concerns understandable but overstated, insisting it was just berries, and suggesting my reaction reflected personal stress rather than a legitimate business loss. She said it warmly, almost kindly, the tone somehow making the dismissal sting even more than open hostility would have. One board member, a quiet woman named Priscilla, finally asked the question I'd been waiting for someone else to ask. Who exactly authorized guests onto private property? Karen paused half a second too long before answering, then blamed overeager volunteers who'd misunderstood casual conversations as formal permission. No volunteer was ever named. No volunteer ever came forward. The explanation floated there, vague and unverifiable, exactly the kind of answer that couldn't be disproven in a single meeting but also couldn't withstand real scrutiny if anyone bothered to look closer, which I quietly promised myself I would. The board ultimately agreed only to review the matter further. The same soft language I'd heard applied to a dozen other disputes over the years, always ending in nothing changing at all. I left that night with my folder still mostly unused, frustration sitting heavier in my chest than before. I didn't stop documenting. If anything, the meeting sharpened my resolve, reminding me that facts alone rarely moved people accustomed to following whoever spoke loudest. I would need more than damaged canes and grainy gate footage. I would need something undeniable, something even Karen's practice calm couldn't talk around. Word of the meeting spread through the neighborhood app within hours, predictably split. Some residents thanked me privately for finally speaking up. Others repeated Karen's framing almost word for word, calling me difficult, ungrateful, someone who couldn't take a joke about sharing a little community abundance. A handful of one-star reviews appeared on my farm's social media page that same week. Vague complaints about unfriendly management, from accounts with no prior activity and no record of ever visiting Hollow Creek. I couldn't prove who wrote them, but the timing left little genuine room for doubt. I reported the reviews to the platform, documented screenshots for my growing folder, and kept working. My regular customers, thankfully, kept showing up, kids in tow, buckets in hand, unaware of any of the noise swirling around their favorite Saturday morning tradition of picking berries beside my grandfather's old barn. It was one of those regulars, an older woman named Ruth, who mentioned something odd in passing while paying for her berries. She'd seen a dessert menu at a new restaurant downtown boasting locally foraged, community-grown blueberries, featuring a photo that looked suspiciously like it had been taken on my own property. Curiosity got the better of me that weekend. I drove to the restaurant, a cozy bistro 2 towns over, and studied the dessert menu myself. A blueberry galette, described proudly as sourced from generous Maple Hollow Community Gardens, priced at $14, made from berries I strongly suspected weren't purchased. I recognized the variety instantly, a rare heirloom cultivar my grandfather had grafted decades ago, distinct in color and shape, sold nowhere else within 100 miles that I knew of. Seeing it plated and monetized under someone else's story felt like watching a stranger wear my family's name. I asked the server, casually, who supplied the restaurant's blueberries. She smiled and said a lovely local woman named Karen delivered fresh baskets nearly every week, always refusing payment beyond a modest thank you, insisting it was simply her joy to support small businesses using community-grown produce. Standing there, folder of evidence already thickening at home, the full picture finally clicked into place. Karen wasn't just sending unauthorized guests to pick for fun. Someone was harvesting those free berries afterward, and that someone was very likely walking straight out of my rows and into her own car. I asked, still casual, how deliveries usually arrived, schedule, timing, anything routine. The server mentioned Thursdays and weekends mostly, right after community events, which matched almost perfectly with the exact dates unauthorized guests had wandered my property. Buckets full, under Karen's smiling supervision at every single incident. Back home, I cross-referenced my camera timestamps against those delivery days. The pattern lined up with uncomfortable precision. Every unauthorized entry preceded a restaurant delivery by less than 24 hours. Too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Too specific to be anything but a deliberate, repeating arrangement. I didn't confront Karen yet. Some instinct told me this discovery was only one piece of something larger, and revealing it too soon would simply hand her time to cover her tracks. I wanted the full picture first, however long it took to gather it properly and undeniably. I called an old college friend, now a small business attorney 2 counties over, and described the situation over coffee one evening. She listened carefully, then explained that unauthorized harvesting and resale of crops could constitute theft under state law, not just a neighborly dispute best settled over a fence. Document everything, she said, tapping the table for emphasis. Dates, footage, financial estimates, anything showing intent rather than accident. She warned me it might take time to build something solid enough to matter, but assured me that pattern and paper trail mattered far more than outrage ever would. I built a proper spreadsheet that week, methodical the way my grandfather had taught me to track yield and expenses decades earlier. Every unauthorized date, every matching restaurant delivery, every dollar of estimated loss. Organized clean enough that even someone unfamiliar with farming could follow the trail without difficulty. Karen, unaware of how closely I'd begun watching, grew bolder at the next board meeting, proposing that Hollow Creek's surplus abundance was being wastefully hoarded while the community could benefit from shared harvest days. She said it with such warmth that several residents actually applauded before I could respond. The proposal framed regular public access as generosity rather than theft, appealing to genuine community spirit among people who had no idea their goodwill was being quietly redirected into someone else's restaurant deliveries. I understood, watching those hopeful faces, that Karen wasn't only harming me, she was using kindness as camouflage. Several homeowners spoke enthusiastically in favor, imagining lazy summer afternoons picking berries together as neighbors. I didn't blame them for the appeal. Most had no idea flyers had been fabricated before, damage left unacknowledged, or that surplus berries had a habit of reappearing on a bistro's dessert menu. I declined again, publicly this time, explaining as plainly as I could that my farm operated as a real business, not a shared amenity, and that previous shared access had already cost me hundreds of dollars in damage and lost inventory. The applause from moments earlier faded into uneasy silence. Karen's warmth cooled noticeably after that meeting, at least toward me. Gone were the performative smiles at the mailbox, replaced by curt nods and conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I walked within earshot. I didn't mind the silence. Felt, in a strange way, more honest than her friendliness ever had. I spent that week reinforcing my perimeter further, replacing rope with low-voltage electric fencing along the picnic-facing boundary, adding a second camera angle near the gate. Whatever came next, I intended to be ready for it, documented, and finally, unmistakably, one careful step ahead of Karen Whitfield's next move. A few quiet weeks followed, harvest routine settling back into its familiar rhythm, early mornings weighing baskets, afternoons restocking the farm stand, evenings doing homework at the kitchen table with Mia and Theo while cicadas hummed outside the open window like nothing had ever gone wrong at all. Theo, 10 and endlessly curious, asked one evening why I'd started locking the gate every night instead of just during winter. I told him simply that some neighbors needed clearer boundaries than others, and he nodded like that made perfect sense. The way children accept adult logic without needing every detail explained. Mr. By more often that stretch. Always with tea or tamales, always asking careful questions about how things stood. One evening he mentioned, almost offhand, that he'd been reviewing old HOA financial disclosures out of pure retiree boredom, noticing a few things that didn't quite add up. Turned out Mr. years as an agricultural inspector before retiring, a career built on noticing exactly the kind of small inconsistencies most people skimmed right past. He offered, casually, to keep looking if I ever needed a second set of trained eyes on anything unusual. I thanked him, genuinely grateful, though I didn't yet grasp how central his quiet diligence would become. At the time, it simply felt good to have someone steady in my corner, someone who remembered the Petersons' bakery and understood exactly what kind of pattern Karen was capable of repeating. Business, meanwhile, picked up nicely through word of mouth alone. New families started showing up on weekends, having heard from friends about the honest little farm with the friendly owner and the rare heirloom berries worth the short drive. I welcomed every one of them properly, through the paying gate. The shared harvest days proposal quietly disappeared from board agendas after my public refusal. No formal withdrawal, just a slow fading the way unpopular ideas sometimes do when their champion senses resistance growing. I let myself believe, cautiously, that the worst of the conflict might finally be settling down. One evening I even considered removing an extra camera near the toolshed, deciding the coverage felt slightly excessive for what now seemed like a resolved dispute. Something small held me back, though, a lingering caution I couldn't quite name, the kind farmers develop after watching enough storms roll in unannounced. Around that time, my regular mail carrier mentioned, while handing over a stack of catalogs, that the HOA office seemed to be generating an unusual amount of financial paperwork lately, more than she typically delivered for a neighborhood association that size. I thanked her and thought little more of it. In hindsight, that small comment deserved more attention than I gave it. At the time, though, life simply moved forward. Baskets weighed, dinners cooked, homework checked, the quiet business of raising 2 kids and running a farm leaving little room to chase every passing unexplained detail. A neighbor mentioned at the mailbox that Braden, Karen's son, had recently been promoted within the County Code Enforcement Office, now handling a wider territory including our own subdivision. I offered polite congratulations on her behalf and filed the fact away without much thought, the way one does most small-talk news. Only later would that promotion feel less like coincidence and more like preparation, though nothing about it seemed sinister in the moment. Life in Maple Hollow simply carried on. Quiet and ordinary, the kind of calm that farmers know better than to trust completely, however welcome it feels while it lasts. Late one afternoon, restocking baskets near the front stand, I noticed Karen's car parked across the street, engine idling, her gaze fixed steadily on my rose for several long minutes before she finally drove away. She never waved, never approached. I simply noted the time and kept working, unbothered outwardly. The calm ended abruptly with a certified letter. Official county letterhead, citing my farm stand signage as non-compliant with updated commercial zoning standards. My sign hadn't changed in years, hadn't drawn a single complaint before. Confused, I called the county office directly to understand what exactly had prompted the notice. The clerk on the phone read me the inspector's name attached to the filing, and my stomach tightened immediately. B. Braden. Now apparently reviewing code compliance in the very subdivision where his mother happened to be locked in an ongoing dispute with one specific resident. I requested, calmly but firmly, that any future inspections of my property be handled by a different officer, citing an obvious and undeniable conflict of interest. The county agreed without much resistance, reassigning my file within the week, though the underlying stress of the encounter lingered far longer than the paperwork. Before the reassignment took effect, though, 2 more notices arrived in quick succession, one citing minor drainage concerns, another questioning parking near my customer entrance. Nothing severe, nothing that would actually hold up under real scrutiny, but each one cost me time, worry, and a small fee to contest. I saved every notice in my growing folder, now organized by date alongside the earlier damage reports and the restaurant discovery. My lawyer friend, reviewing the pattern over the phone, said it was starting to resemble something courts took seriously, a documented pattern of retaliatory harassment, not isolated bureaucratic hiccups. Meanwhile, Karen's public campaign continued elsewhere, more visibly than ever. She set up a booth at the county farmers market one Saturday. Baskets labeled, Maple Hollow Community Harvest. Bright hand-painted signage. No mention anywhere of Hollow Creek Farm or the actual source of the berries filling those baskets. I visited the market myself that morning, partly out of curiosity, partly because something told me I needed to see it firsthand rather than hear about it secondhand. Karen stood behind her table, cheerful and animated, handing out samples to strangers who had no idea whose land those berries came from. I approached calmly, introduced myself to a nearby customer as the actual grower, and watched confusion spread across several faces at once. Karen's smile faltered for the first time in public, replaced quickly by a practiced recovery, though her eyes betrayed something sharper flickering just beneath the surface composure. Where exactly do these berries come from? I asked her directly, voice even, aware that phones were already lifting around us to record whatever happened next. Karen said something vague about generous community donations, unable to name a single specific resident who had supposedly contributed a single basket. A small crowd gathered, sensing tension the way crowds always do. I stayed calm, simply stating facts. My farm, my heirloom variety, no record of any donation arrangement ever discussed with me. Karen's composure cracked slightly, her voice rising just enough to draw more attention than she likely intended. Someone's phone video from that exchange found its way into the neighborhood group chat by evening, then spread further into a local community forum overnight. The clip was short, unremarkable on its surface, yet something about Karen's stammered non-answer struck a nerve with people who'd simply never seen her flustered before. Support that had once felt evenly split began tilting more visibly in my direction. Messages arrived from residents I'd barely spoken to before, apologizing for doubting me earlier, admitting they'd simply trusted Karen's version of events without ever questioning it. I thanked each one, careful not to gloat. Karen responded to the growing scrutiny not with an apology, but with a formal complaint filed against me for public harassment and defamation at the farmer's market. The accusation stunned me. I'd asked one simple question in a public space. Nothing more. Yet somehow I'd become the accused. The HOA board, unable to ignore the mounting noise any longer, scheduled a special session to address what they diplomatically called ongoing community tension. I prepared thoroughly, organizing my evidence into a single clear binder: camera stills, financial estimates, code notices, and the restaurant menu photograph, all dated and labeled. The night before that meeting, I heard my perimeter alarm chirp softly around 2 in the morning. I checked the camera feed from my phone and found my rope and post boundary along the picnic side cut clean through, the electric fence disabled at its junction box. Deliberately and precisely, footage showed a figure moving quickly along the fence line in the dark, face obscured by a hood, movements careful and unhurried in a way that suggested familiarity with exactly where my cameras were positioned. I couldn't confirm identity from the grainy clip alone, but the build looked unsettlingly familiar. By morning I found 2 sections of fence entirely breached, footprints leading directly into my 3rd row, several bushes stripped overnight of nearly ripe fruit. Whoever it was had known precisely which rows produced the most and exactly when to strike. Hours before a meeting meant to address unauthorized access. I called the local police department that morning, filed an official report for trespassing and property damage. Evidence photographs and camera footage attached. The responding officer took careful notes, then mentioned, almost in passing, that our HOA president had quite a colorful history with prior small business disputes nearby. Curious about that offhand comment, I asked the officer directly what he meant. He couldn't share specifics, citing privacy, but suggested I might find useful information in public HOA election and bylaw records if I truly wanted the full picture behind Karen Whitfield's authority within Maple Hollow Estates. That evening I called Mr. Alvarez, mentioning the officer's comment. He went quiet for a moment, then said he'd been meaning to check something himself for weeks. Using an old contact at the county clerk's office, he offered to pull the HOA's official election filings the very next morning. What he found 2 days later changed everything. According to filed county records, Karen's official term as HOA president had legally expired 14 months earlier. No re-election had ever been held. No paperwork filed extending her authority, meaning every decision she'd made since then existed in a strange legal vacuum. I sat with that information a long while, turning it over carefully. Every permission Karen had granted, every liability she'd claimed covered my property during unauthorized visits, every signature on HOA documents, all of it potentially void, made by a woman who technically held no official authority to make it. Mr. Energized rather than alarmed, mentioned he'd also noticed odd patterns while glancing through recent HOA financial disclosures months earlier, vague vendor names and recurring charges he hadn't fully understood at the time. Suddenly those loose threads felt far less random than they had before. He agreed to keep quietly auditing the association's dues spending, treating it now as more than idle retiree curiosity. I agreed to keep documenting the farm side of things, every unauthorized visit, every damage report, every restaurant delivery date, until our 2 threads of evidence could finally meet in the middle. Within a week, Mr. Alvarez laid several printed statements across my kitchen table, pointing to a recurring line item labeled Community Garden Landscaping. Paid quarterly to a vendor account with no clear business registration attached. No receipts. No invoices matching typical landscaping costs for an association our size. I cross-referenced the payment dates against my own spreadsheet almost without thinking. Years of habit making the pattern impossible to miss. Every single landscaping payment fell within days of an unauthorized visit to my property, matching restaurant delivery dates with uncomfortable, undeniable precision across nearly a full calendar year. This isn't just spite anymore, Mr. Alvarez said quietly, sliding the statements together. This is money. I stared at the total circled at the bottom of his notes. A figure large enough to make clear this had never been about berries alone, but about something Karen had built carefully over time. We agreed, sitting there at my kitchen table, that revealing pieces of this separately would let Karen explain each one away individually. Only a complete picture, expired authority, financial trail, harassment pattern, unauthorized resale, presented together would leave no room for her practiced deflections to find any footing. I upgraded my security once more that week, adding a discreet audio-capable camera near the main gate, unwilling to leave anything to chance while we quietly assembled a case neither of us intended to lose. Whatever came next, I wanted every word, every movement, recorded beyond dispute. Karen, sensing scrutiny tightening around her without knowing its exact source, grew visibly anxious in casual neighborhood interactions, her usual polish slipping into shorter, clipped conversations. Even her allies on the board seemed to be keeping quieter distance, as though something unspoken had begun shifting beneath the surface of Maple Hollow. Then came her boldest move yet, an announcement of an emergency HOA vote, scheduled with unusually short notice, proposing to formally designate my farm a permanent shared community resource, language vague enough to potentially force public access regardless of my ownership or my repeatedly stated objections. If passed, the measure could tie my hands legally within the association's own bylaws, even if those bylaws themselves rested on shaky, possibly invalid authority. I understood immediately that Karen intended to lock in her access before anyone thought to question the legitimacy of the presidency pushing the vote through. I mentioned the expired term discovery quietly to my attorney friend, who confirmed my instinct: any vote conducted under an unauthorized officer's leadership would likely hold no real legal weight. But proving that formally could still take time neither of us felt confident Karen would patiently wait for. We need to act before that vote, Mr. Alvarez said firmly, and I agreed completely. Whatever we revealed, however we revealed it, needed to happen before Karen could claim a fresh mandate from residents who had no idea the entire foundation beneath her leadership had quietly crumbled months earlier. We spent the following days finalizing everything, organizing financial statements, camera stills, harassment timelines, and election records into a single clear binder anyone could follow without a law degree. I practiced explaining each piece aloud in my kitchen, wanting my voice steady when it finally mattered most. Karen, meanwhile, pushed her campaign harder across the neighborhood app, framing the emergency vote as finally settling the farm question for good, implying my continued resistance was simply stubbornness standing between Maple Hollow and a shared community treasure she alone had generously fought to secure for everyone. A rumor began circulating that week, vague but damaging, suggesting my farm was somehow under investigation for unspecified safety concerns. No source, no details, just enough uncertainty to make a few hesitant customers cancel weekend visits. A small but noticeable dip appearing in my usual Saturday morning traffic. I tracked that dip carefully too. Dates and dollar amounts added to my growing spreadsheet. Another quiet casualty of Karen's campaign to control the narrative before facts could catch up with her. Hurt as I was, I kept my public responses minimal, saving my full answer for the meeting itself. 2 evenings before the vote, Karen appeared at my gate unannounced. Alone, her tone softer than I'd heard in months. "We could be partners in this," she said, almost gently, suggesting a formal arrangement that would let her manage community access while I simply focused on growing the fruit. I declined calmly, explaining once more that my farm wasn't available for that kind of arrangement, official term or not. Her expression shifted then, warmth draining away fast, replaced by something colder. "You'll find this a lot harder to fight than you think," she said quietly, before turning back toward her car. My gate camera, audio enabled just as Mr. Alvarez had suggested, captured every word of that exchange clearly, time-stamped and unmistakably in Karen's own voice. I sat with the recording that night, equal parts unsettled and strangely relieved that her threat now existed somewhere beyond just my own memory. 2 nights later, someone opened the main water valve near my northern rows, flooding an entire section overnight, soaking the base of decades-old heirloom bushes my grandfather had personally grafted. By morning I found standing water threatening root rot in plants that had survived nearly 50 years of Ohio winters. The gate camera footage again showed a shadowed figure near the valve housing, this time wearing a distinctive HOA-branded windbreaker I'd seen Karen wear to nearly every community event that summer. The image wasn't perfectly clear, but combined with everything else, it felt far too specific to dismiss as coincidence. I called the police again, filed a second report referencing the earlier fence damage, submitted both video clips as evidence. The officer taking my statement noted the pattern himself, remarking quietly that 2 similar incidents within weeks, tied to an ongoing dispute, rarely turned out to be unrelated occurrences. Karen, when questioned briefly by police as part of routine follow-up, claimed she'd been home alone all night, offering no witness to confirm her whereabouts. My attorney friend, reviewing the growing timeline, said the pattern was now strong enough to support a genuine harassment and vandalism case if it came to that. Even Braden seemed to be pulling away by then. A neighbor mentioned overhearing him hesitate outside his own house when his mother pressed him about one more inspection on my property. His usual quick compliance replaced by visible discomfort neither of them bothered to hide from the open window. A small crack had clearly appeared even inside Karen's own family, though I wouldn't fully understand its depth until much later. For now, I simply noted it, filed it away with everything else, and turned my full attention toward the emergency vote now standing just 2 days ahead. Karen, undeterred by the widening cracks around her, recruited her most loyal board ally to push the emergency meeting notice out with barely 48 hours warning, technically violating the association's own bylaws requiring at least a week for major proposals affecting individual homeowners' property rights. Mr. out quietly that same day to a contact within the state's HOA oversight office, seeking clarity on exactly how expired leadership terms affected the legitimacy of votes conducted under them. The response, when it arrived, confirmed everything we'd suspected with reassuring, official precision. An association operating past its officers' expired terms, The contact explained, could not legally bind members to newly introduced votes or bylaw changes until proper elections resumed. Whatever happened Saturday, if the vote passed, it would carry no actual legal force behind it, regardless of how confidently Karen presented it. We decided, deliberately, not to expose this before the meeting. Karen had spent months controlling every narrative available to her: newsletters, group chats, flyers, farmers market booths. This time, we wanted her walking fully into her own trap, publicly, with no room left to spin an explanation afterward. I spent the days before the vote quiet and outwardly calm, attending to normal farm business, letting Karen believe her pressure campaign had finally worn me down. She grew visibly more confident with each passing day, mistaking my silence for surrender rather than the careful preparation it actually represented. She posted on the neighborhood app that certain stubborn residents would finally fall in line once the community spoke clearly through Saturday's vote. A neutral resident, uneasy about the tone, quietly screenshotted the post before it mysteriously disappeared a few hours later, preserving it for what would later matter. The night before the meeting, Karen apparently programmed my old gate code onto a spare access fob, intending guest access for Saturday's anticipated celebration. She had no way of knowing I changed that code weeks earlier, and every failed attempt against the new code logged silently onto my system. Saturday morning arrived heavy with anticipation neighborhood-wide, everyone sensing something unusual building beneath the surface, though few understood exactly what. I dressed simply, packed my binder into a plain folder, and drove the short distance to the clubhouse with Mr. Alvarez following close behind in his own car. The clubhouse parking lot filled faster than I'd ever seen it, cars lining both sides of the street, residents clearly expecting the farm dispute to finally reach some kind of resolution. I took a deep breath before stepping inside, folder tucked under my arm, prepared for whatever came next. Karen stood already at the front table when I entered, composed, notes arranged with practiced precision, gavel resting beside her water glass like a prop in a performance she'd rehearsed countless times before this exact moment finally arrived in front of her captive neighborhood audience. She opened the meeting briskly, framing the emergency vote as finally settling the farm question for the good of everyone. Her voice warm and confident, carrying the easy authority of someone entirely unaware that the very foundation of her authority no longer legally existed beneath her feet. Her loyal ally seconded every motion almost instantly, clearly rehearsed, moving procedural formalities along with unusual speed meant to leave little room for interruption or extended discussion before the actual vote could be called, and quietly, quickly finalized in Karen's favor before real scrutiny arrived. I sat near the back, folder closed on my lap, watching quietly as Karen presented a slideshow featuring cherry-picked photographs implying my rows sat mostly neglected, ripe for community benefit. Several residents nodded along, glancing occasionally in my direction, sensing tension building beneath the room's polite surface calm. Karen called for initial comments before moving to the actual vote, clearly expecting little meaningful resistance given the room's generally agreeable mood. Mr. Hand first. Calm and unhurried, simply asking to review the association's bylaws on record before any formal vote proceeded further that evening. Karen, mildly dismissive, assured him the bylaws were standard, nothing new to review, attempting to move quickly past the request. Mr. Gently but firmly, asking a simple, Direct question. Precisely when had Karen's current term as president officially begun, according to filed county records? A flicker of hesitation crossed Karen's face, quickly smoothed over by a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes this time. She deflected, insisting the question was irrelevant to tonight's agenda, clearly hoping the room would simply move along without dwelling on something she'd rather not answer directly. I finally stood, voice steady despite my racing heart, and asked to be formally recognized before any vote proceeded. Karen, unable to refuse without appearing suspicious in front of the full room watching closely, allowed it with a tight, forced nod, gesturing me toward the small podium at the front. I walked forward, opened my folder, and asked the room a simple opening question rather than launching straight into accusations. Can anyone here confirm the last time Maple Hollow held an actual HOA board election? Silence spread quickly across the room, nobody able to answer with any real certainty. I placed the county election record onto the overhead projector, the filing date clearly visible to everyone seated. Karen's official term, the document showed plainly, had expired 14 months earlier, with no re-election ever filed, no extension granted, no legal basis for the authority she'd exercised ever since. Murmurs rippled steadily through the crowd as people absorbed what they were seeing. Karen's loyal ally shifted uncomfortably in his chair beside her, putting a few inches of visible distance between them without quite realizing he was doing it, an instinctive retreat from something suddenly looking far less safe. Karen attempted to interrupt, insisting this was merely a paperwork technicality, something easily corrected and hardly worth derailing an important community vote over. I stayed calm, said there was more to share, and simply asked the room for 2 additional minutes of patience before any decisions were finalized. I pulled up the photograph of the restaurant's dessert menu next, the community harvest berries clearly matching my farm's rare heirloom variety in color and shape. Several longtime residents gasped softly, recognizing the exact fruit they'd picked themselves at my stand for years without ever seeing it plated elsewhere. Karen's ally quietly slid his chair another few inches away from the head table, visibly distancing himself from whatever was unfolding. Karen's composure cracked slightly for the first time all evening, her jaw tightening, knuckles whitening as her hands gripped the edge of the podium in front of her. I explained, voice never rising, that the next part concerned HOA dues directly, not simply missing berries or damaged fences. I asked the association's treasurer, seated near the front, to confirm aloud a specific recurring line item labeled Community Garden Landscaping that had appeared quarterly in recent financial disclosures. The treasurer, visibly nervous under sudden attention, confirmed the line item existed in the records but admitted, haltingly, that he had no receipts or invoices on file to substantiate what specific work that recurring payment had actually covered over the many months it had quietly appeared on the books. I revealed next that the vendor account receiving those payments traced back to a relative connected to Karen's own family, a detail Mr. Alvarez had confirmed through public business registration records days earlier. Gasps turned quickly into open, angry murmurs spreading across the packed clubhouse in waves. That's simply a coincidence, Karen said, her voice rising sharply for the first time that evening. All trace of her earlier practiced warmth suddenly gone entirely, replaced by something tighter and far less composed than the confident woman who'd opened the meeting barely 20 minutes earlier. I played the audio recording next, the one captured at my gate 2 nights before the flooding incident. Karen's own voice unmistakable delivering her quiet, veiled threat about how difficult I would find fighting her. The room fell completely, utterly silent, several residents visibly stunned by what they were hearing. Karen's loyal ally stood abruptly, putting real physical distance between himself and the head table now, insisting loudly that he'd known absolutely nothing about any of this. Karen turned on him instantly, snapping that he'd personally approved every one of those vendor payments himself. Month after month. Cornered, he admitted, voice shaking, that he'd signed what Karen had always described to him simply as routine landscaping expenses, never questioning further because questioning Karen had never seemed worth the trouble it inevitably caused anyone who dared to try it within the association. I showed the flooded row footage next. The HOA branded windbreaker clearly visible on the shadowed figure near the water valve. A resident in the front row whispered loudly enough for others to hear that the jacket looked exactly like the one Karen wore to practically every single community event. "Someone must have stolen that jacket," Karen said quickly, grasping visibly for any explanation still available to her. I noted calmly that both incidents were already filed as official police reports weeks earlier, timestamps intact. Evidence submitted well before tonight's meeting had even been announced to residents. Karen's son Braden, seated quietly near the back of the room, lowered his head slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the direction everything had taken. I mentioned gently, without any real malice, the retaliatory code violations filed under his name during the same period his mother's campaign had been escalating. Braden stood then, voice unsteady but audible throughout the silent room, admitting his mother had pressured him repeatedly to file those notices against me specifically, despite there being no genuine code violations present on my property at the time each complaint had actually been submitted. That single admission from her own son seemed to break something visible in Karen's expression. A crack spreading quickly across the composed mask she'd maintained through everything else so far. The room, once genuinely split in its sympathies, now turned almost entirely and unmistakably toward my side of the story. Karen tried one final pivot, accusing me of orchestrating an elaborate smear campaign against her, her voice tight with something closer to panic now than confidence. I simply said I had one more piece of evidence, and asked the room, quietly, for a final moment of patience before finishing. I revealed the failed gate code access logs from that very morning, showing a login attempt using an old, unauthorized code just hours before the meeting began. The logs directly contradicted Karen's earlier claim that tonight's vote concerned only the community's future, rather than her own continued personal access. A board member near the front finally moved to formally table the emergency vote pending a full independent investigation into everything just presented. The motion passed almost unanimously within seconds, only Karen and her visibly shaken ally choosing to abstain from a decision the rest of the room clearly welcomed. Karen, face flushed red, attempted to gather her notes and leave abruptly, but the room's heavy, expectant silence seemed to physically stop her at the door. An elderly resident near the exit, calm but unmistakably firm, simply asked her to please sit back down and answer for herself properly. Karen turned slowly, and for the first time all summer, appeared to have absolutely nothing rehearsed left to offer the room watching her so closely. Mr. Informing everyone quietly that the state's HOA Oversight Office had already been formally notified in writing days earlier. Color drained visibly from Karen's face at the mention of an outside authority now genuinely involved. I closed my folder gently, having said everything I'd come to say, and stepped back from the podium as the room shifted its full attention toward whatever would happen to Karen next. The board called immediately for a formal vote of no confidence in Karen's continued leadership role. Procedural correctness restored the moment actual authority within the room finally reasserted itself. Hands rose almost instantly across the clubhouse. An overwhelming, nearly unanimous majority standing firmly against her continued presidency. Karen was removed from the HOA presidency on the spot. Effective immediately, the decision recorded formally in meeting minutes taken carefully by a volunteer secretary who, for once that summer, had something genuinely historic worth writing down accurately for Maple Hollow's official records. A temporary board, led by Mr. Alvarez himself, was appointed on the spot to oversee the transition and launch a full financial audit of the association's recent spending. Particularly the mysterious community garden landscaping line item everyone in the room now understood needed much closer scrutiny. Word of the meeting spread through the neighborhood app within the hour. No exaggeration necessary for once. The plain facts dramatic enough entirely on their own. Screenshots, quotes, and second-hand accounts circulated rapidly among residents who hadn't attended but wished, quite visibly, that they somehow had. The restaurant owner, hearing second-hand news the following morning, called me directly, mortified, insisting he genuinely believed the berries were legitimately donated community produce. He offered full restitution and a public correction to his menu, clearly embarrassed at having unknowingly profited from Karen's carefully constructed deception for months. I accepted his apology graciously, more interested in the truth finally surfacing than in punishing someone who'd simply trusted a neighbor's word in good faith. Within days, his menu proudly credited Hollow Creek Farm by name, an unexpected but welcome bit of free advertising following months of quiet loss. County officials opened a formal inquiry into the misused HOA vendor funds soon after. Examining records Mr. Alvarez had already partially assembled. Investigators confirmed over $11,000 had been funneled through the fake landscaping account over roughly a year. Money collected from every homeowner's regular association dues. Karen's relative, listed on the suspicious vendor account, was contacted by investigators and quickly distanced himself from the arrangement, claiming he'd simply allowed Karen use of his business registration as a favor, unaware exactly how the funds were being justified or spent on official HOA paperwork. Braden, to his credit, cooperated fully with the county's subsequent review of his code enforcement filings, providing honest context about the pressure he'd faced from his mother. His retaliatory notices against my farm were formally voided and struck entirely from official county records within a matter of weeks. Karen hired an attorney to respond to the mounting inquiries. But between recorded audio, time-stamped camera footage, financial paper trails, and her own son's testimony, the available options for a meaningful defense grew thinner by the day, no matter how carefully her legal team tried to frame each piece. She was ultimately ordered to repay the misused association funds in full and formally barred from ever serving on any Maple Hollow HOA board again. A restriction written directly into the amended bylaws the new interim board approved unanimously during their very first official meeting together. The vandalism and trespassing charges connected to the fence cutting and flooding incidents moved forward separately through the local court system, no longer treatable as simply an unfortunate neighborhood disagreement between two strong-willed women who'd simply disagreed about berries and community spirit for one long, difficult summer. My farm, meanwhile, experienced an unexpected wave of renewed support once the full story settled into the neighborhood's shared understanding. Weekend sales climbed higher than any previous season. Longtime customers returning alongside curious new visitors who'd simply heard, through one channel or another, an honest story worth supporting. The new interim board, eager to repair genuine trust rather than simply move past the controversy quietly, offered me an official paid partnership for future community events. Properly contracted this time with real insurance coverage, real scheduled hours, and real compensation reflecting the actual value of my land and labor. I agreed, on my own carefully considered terms, appreciating finally being asked rather than simply informed after the fact. It felt like a genuinely different kind of relationship with Maple Hollow Estates, one built on mutual respect rather than assumption, negotiated openly instead of quietly decided somewhere behind my back. Karen, according to neighbors who still occasionally mentioned her, moved out of Maple Hollow Estates before her county case fully concluded, choosing a quieter departure, over facing continued scrutiny from residents who'd once trusted her leadership completely and now understood exactly how thoroughly that trust had been misused. The State Oversight Office confirmed, in a formal letter to the new interim board, that Maple Hollow's HOA was required to hold a fully legitimate, properly noticed re-election within 60 days, restoring official structure to an association that had drifted, unnoticed by most, for well over a year. Weeks later, residents gathered again in that same clubhouse, this time for a genuine, properly conducted election. A longtime resident named Frank, known mostly for his quiet reliability and complete disinterest in controlling anyone else's business, was elected president by a comfortable, clearly relieved majority of the neighborhood. My blueberry rose slowly healed from the flooding damage as summer stretched toward autumn, new growth pushing steadily through soil that had briefly threatened decades of careful cultivation. My grandfather's heirloom bushes, resilient as ever, proved sturdier than whatever storm Karen had tried to plant among their roots. Braden stopped by one quiet afternoon, awkward but sincere, offering a genuine apology in person for his role in the retaliatory notices. He later helped repair the damaged section of fence himself, working silently beside me for an entire Saturday, an unspoken gesture that felt more honest than any words could. Mia and Theo helped restock the farm stand most weekends now, laughing occasionally about the whole strange ordeal finally settling into something closer to neighborhood legend than lived stress. Watching them work easily beside familiar customers reminded me exactly why I'd fought so hard to protect this place at all. I never wanted a fight, only fairness, and standing in my rows most mornings now, watching honest customers weigh their own baskets at the honor table. Fairness finally felt like something genuinely restored rather than simply hoped for through one long, exhausting, unexpected summer of quiet documentation. Every basket I'd ever weighed, every camera angle I'd carefully installed, every quiet night spent building a spreadsheet nobody else knew existed, all of it mattered in the end. Proof that patience and careful attention could outlast even the loudest, most confident voice in any crowded room. The gate stays locked now only for guests I haven't personally invited. Code changed once more for good measure. Cameras still watching quietly out of habit more than necessity. Everyone else remains welcome, exactly as they always were, on my terms, in my rows, under my grandfather's old blueberry sky.